This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 144 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, we're going to teach you everything you need to know about making a great screencast video. A screencast video is one where you hear a person's voice talking and on the screen you see something else, like maybe a demonstration of a tech tool or a slideshow of some kind, or maybe even words and diagrams being drawn on the screen as the presenter talks. Basically, a screencast shows you whatever is on the presenter's screen while the presenter narrates. If you ever went to YouTube to learn how to do something techie, chances are you watched a screencast video. I absolutely love screencasts. In fact, creating screencast videos was my very first foray into more advanced technology. I was working with student teachers, meeting with them for 7 full days throughout their student teaching semester to help them with their final projects. Everything was going fine, but then one semester we were told we had to reduce our in-person meetings from 7 days to 2. Suddenly, and without much warning, I was forced to quickly figure out a way to get the same amount of help and information to my students in 2 days that I used to do in 7. That's when I learned how to make a screencast video. I took all the lectures that I had given in class, lectures that involved me going through the complicated parts of their project forms in painstaking detail, and recorded them on video. Then I uploaded the videos to the university servers and shared them with students. Just like that, I replaced hours of time I used to spend on lectures with videos my students could watch whenever they wanted to. Even better, they could re-watch them to review sections they didn't quite get the first time around. Once these were done, I could use my remaining 2 days of class time to interact directly with students rather than spending all that time lecturing. Whether you're in a situation like I was, where you're suddenly and without warning finding that you need to create instructional videos, or you're just wanting to move some of your direct instruction to video so that you can personalize learning for students and free up class time for other things, you will benefit from some tips on how to make good quality screencasts. That's what we're focusing on in this episode. My guest today is Kareem Farah, a former high school math teacher and founder of the Modern Classrooms Project, a nonprofit organization that helps teachers learn to shift their classrooms to a blended learning model where each student works at his or her own pace. Part of the model is built on video-based instruction, so Kareem is going to share with us the principles they use to train teachers on how to make their own screencasts. We'll talk about the ideal length for a screencast video, whether you should talk fast or slow, how to design good slides, and some basic affordable tech tools that can help you put it all together. Before we get started, I want to thank World 101 for sponsoring this episode. Do your students actually understand what a trade deficit is? Do they understand the difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker? Do they know that zombies have something to teach us about fighting pandemics? If you answered no to any of these questions, check out World 101 from the Council on Foreign Relations. World 101 is a growing library of free multimedia resources that explains the fundamentals of international relations and foreign policy through engaging, interactive storytelling. And did I mention it's free? World 101 will help your students become better informed, invest in their futures, and make a difference. Get them started today at world101.cfr.org. That's world101.cfr.org. Support also comes from ViewSonic. ViewSonic has been dedicated to being part of the educational community for over 30 years. They want to help the millions of teachers and students finding themselves trying to learn from home. They're currently offering free access to their My Viewboard digital whiteboarding software, giving teachers all the distance learning tools they need to continue to conduct classes. Now, My Viewboard includes new features released for distance learning. Check it out today and get access at myviewboard.com/distance-learning. That's myviewboard.com/distance-learning. Now here's my conversation with Kareem Farah about making fantastic screencast videos. Kareem, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So we are going to be talking today primarily about screencast videos. And so before we get into all the details, just give my listeners an idea of what you do in education, what's your background, and what you're doing now.
Absolutely. So, I was a teacher for 6 years, and I launched the Modern Classrooms Project about 2 years ago. And when I was an educator, I spent my entire career in highly diverse environments, in schools that served a high proportion of low-income students. And when I was an educator, I was really, really flustered initially by the fact that most of my students had an incredibly broad diversity of learning levels. And as an educator, I really didn't understand how to meet those needs. So I basically went on a mission to figure out how to eliminate my traditional lectures. I realized that the traditional lecture was serving as a bottleneck in my classroom. Kids were really having trouble accessing content, and truancy was just making it very, very difficult to stay on point and get through coursework.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually started building screencasts to eliminate the lecture from my classroom. So about 5 years ago, I started building screencasts, and I basically completely eliminated my lecture in my classrooms. And from there, it transitioned to a self-paced, mastery-based model where students would access content that I made through blended instruction through screencasts. Kids would work at their own pace within each unit of study, and then I'd grade them exclusively on mastery. So instead of transitioning from lesson 1 to lesson 2 based on a calendar, they transitioned from lesson 1 to lesson 2 based on what they actually understood.
Mm-hmm.
At the time, I hadn't known that this model would ever scale, but the DC Public Schools gave me the award for Most Innovative Educator of the Year. And it was after that that I had suddenly started fielding a lot of inquiries from folks around how to implement the model, how they could recreate in their own classrooms. And that kind of prompted the creation of the Modern Classrooms Project, which is a nonprofit whose sole goal is to empower educators to implement the blended self-paced mastery-based model that me and my co-founder had developed in our classrooms. And we do that through a multitude of methods. Our big program here in the DC area is a fellowship where we take on fellows, we train them over the summer, and then we support them throughout the school year. In addition to that, we support educators in school districts on a partnership basis. And then more recently, with the distance learning experience, we support thousands of educators through our online course.
Got it. Yeah, and primarily the way that instruction is delivered through this blended model is with the screencast video, correct?
Correct. Now, I think one cautionary tale, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, is
Mm-hmm.
that, kids don't actually spend that much time watching the videos.
Mm-hmm.
Sound pedagogy tells a story where kids actually spend significantly more time problem solving and wrestling with content. But you're absolutely correct that direct instruction component has been removed in a traditional lecture format and shifted to screencasts.
Okay. And so that's why I asked you to come on here and sort of share with us how you train teachers into making high quality screencasts, because so many of them now are having to do this for the first time ever because we are in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic and everybody is at home right now. And so lots of teachers are making their very first screencasts ever, and some of them feel really, really lost.
Absolutely. And I would add that it's a unique time to build screencasts because normally when we use technology in education, I think the gut reaction is to use existing content that's out there.
Mm-hmm.
But in a distance learning setting, kids want to hear from their teachers and teachers want to see their kids. So the screencast presents a really exciting opportunity to build your own videos, your own content, and still kind of maintain that relationship in this remote learning environment.
Right. And actually part of the other thing that people listening need to know is that you are also writing a guest post for Cult of Pedagogy that is going to be sharing these same tips. And so if they want to remember what we talked about, they can go there. This is episode 144 on the podcast list. But one of the pieces of research that you share in that post is that kids are actually more likely to watch a video if it is their instructor or someone they know on the video versus sort of a stranger from a YouTube video, for example.
Absolutely. And, I learned this both anecdotally and then looking at the research after we started the Modern Classrooms Project. So more anecdotally, any great educator knows that building trust with students is probably the most important thing you need to establish when you build a healthy classroom. Naturally, when a student sits in a classroom and they open a computer and instead of hearing from their teacher, they're hearing from a disembodied voice elsewhere, that kind of damages their capacity to trust that the educator is the expert in the room. So I saw quickly that first, my kids were losing trust in me when I outsourced content. And If you're teaching with a broad diversity of learning levels, outsourced content, cookie cutter content, isn't built for your student who's 2 to 3 grade levels behind. That student needs a different type of communication to ensure that you're filling in gaps. So when you use external resources, while valuable and convenient, it often misses the mark from an engagement standpoint.
Right.
And then when you layer on top some of the research that's out there, it's quite compelling. Simple research studies that show that if a hand appears, that is your own teacher's hand, or their voice, or a picture of them appears, it just increases the likelihood that kids are going to engage. And it shouldn't be a surprise to most educators, because most educators just fundamentally know how important it is to build a trusting relationship with kids.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, though, because I think a lot of teachers sort of doubt their own abilities. And so they think, oh, it would be better for me to get a video that was made by, a quote professional or something like that. And it's those sort of messier human elements that actually, it turns out, make these videos maybe more compelling to your students who you have a relationship with.
Absolutely. In fact, what I tell folks whenever I present to educators is blended learning doesn't need to be pretty, it needs to be personal. By design, technology is an impersonal situation. And sure, when used correctly, it can make it more personal. But if you are not going to stand in front of your students and deliver new content, you have to be wary of the fact that you're losing an aspect of that personal touch. And if you simply completely eliminate it, that's dangerous. But if you can create a middle ground where you're still not necessarily delivering it in person, but you're doing it over a screencast, it creates a certain level of comfort that your kids will need.
Great. I think that's a really good message for people to hear right now. Okay, so we're going to get into, some of the nuts and bolts here in terms of what teachers need to know about making good screencasts. So let's start with some of the things that you've learned from research about the sort of length of videos and the way that they're designed.
Absolutely. So, length, the narrative here has been around for some time now, and it's just quite clear. You have to keep videos short. And to put it simply, your goal should be to keep any instructional video between 0 and 6 minutes. If you go up to 9 minutes, that's fine. Engagement still remains high in the 90%. As soon as you exceed 9 minutes, you actually get into this 50% engagement zone. And then over 12 minutes, and it's a total disaster. And again, I saw this both anecdotally as well as through the research. I taught high school math, and some of those concepts are extremely long and drawn out, and you have to chunk aggressively. And I made a few videos that were 13, 14 minutes, and it was incredible to see how quickly kids would disengage when the videos were too long. So the length story is just keep it as short as possible, and a target is 6 minutes or under. And if you're teaching some kind of longer, more aggressive content, going up to 9 minutes is fine, but really over 9 minutes, and you have to reconsider how you're structuring the content, which sort of leads to that next frontier of research, which is the value of chunking. Most educators live in a world where they think about classes in 45, 60, and 80-minute chunks of time, which is just really restrictive in general, and quite arbitrary. So what's cool about using screencasts and eliminating lectures is instead of thinking about time that way, you can think about time as sort of a unit experience as opposed to an individual lesson. So normally you try to pack in all this content to ensure that kids have 45 or 60 or 80 minutes of work. Instead, create a video that covers a skill. If the work associated with that is 20 minutes, wonderful. Then you'll have another video for them after that. If the video leads to 2 full days of work, wonderful as well, even better. That means you've built an incredibly self-directed task for kids to tackle. So you don't need to think as much around, I need to chunk content to meet some type of arbitrary time constraint. Instead, you chunk content to make sure the videos are short enough and they address one individual skill.
Good. And another sort of tip that I learned from you that was counterintuitive, I thought, and now it makes perfect sense, is you talked about the speed at which a person is actually speaking. That can actually add or subtract 2 to 3 minutes off of a video, depending on how slowly a person speaks. What can you tell us about speech and how fast we should be talking on our videos?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it kind of goes back to this sort of keeping it personal idea. When we are in interpersonal conversations with friends, we don't speak slowly. In fact, right now, I'm probably speaking quite fast, and so are you, because we're having a conversation. So when you speak really slowly, it sounds monotone and almost manufactured, and actually decreases the amount of engagement that kids experience. So you actually want to speak conversationally and you want to speak quickly. It sounds more interesting, and it's actually quite jarring when you hear it in video form. In other words, if I watch a person who's speaking slowly and enunciating, it's not all that jarring in a presentation. But when I put in headphones and hear someone just go very slowly through content, it's just mundane and quite boring. So that should be both a relief for teachers, because it means you can speak a lot more naturally. But it also is a way to keep videos short, because obviously the faster you speak, the less time it's going to take.
Right. And kids can always rewind if they need to rehear things, which is kind of different from an in-person lecture. I was always taught to pause frequently and sort of, make sure that I speak slowly so that people have a chance to absorb what I'm saying. That's more of a performance tip in person. But on video, you kind of want to get to the point quickly, and people can listen over and over again if they want to.
Right. I mean, you're even isolating the reason why I built this model in the first place, right? Outside of this whole distance learning world. When you teach in environments with high levels of truancy, all that delicious information that you're delivering in person is not being housed anywhere.
Yeah.
So that means kids that are missing that moment or are disengaged or are experiencing trauma and just can't listen.
Yep.
They don't get to get that experience back.
Yeah.
And what's cool about the video creation experience is it's housed there forever. Kids can go there forever. And we found that this is particularly impactful for students with language barriers, because it's so hard for them to watch a lecture at the same speed as a peer who has a different level of understanding of the current language that they're trying to listen to the lecture in. That's really, really overwhelming. So students with language barriers really appreciate the fact that they can actually pause the video, go back to the video, so they don't get stuck on any moment of the lecture and feel like they've lost their ability to understand what's going on.
Got it. Yeah, that's an excellent point. So we've talked a bit about the length of the video, ideally less than 6 minutes, if necessary between 6 and 9, but definitely no more than 9. What about design principles in terms of like your visuals?
Absolutely. So, I mean, the general premise here, and it shouldn't surprise anyone, is you want to be as visual as possible. So, it's just not that engaging to see a screencast with a bunch of words on it. That's really just overwhelming for kids. And one of the interesting things that this is rooted in sort of research around cognitive load is it's just really difficult for a kid to listen, read, and write at the same time.
Yes.
That's just an overwhelming experience for anyone to do, let alone a kid who's learning a new skill. So you want to be very visual driven. When possible, you want to annotate and write yourself. So you really want to be driving sort of the experience. And we always tell folks when we train teachers to always do something on the screen as you're talking. In other words, if I just sit and am recording over some document or sort of slide deck, and it's just this like stagnant image and I'm talking, that's just not engaging.
Right.
And it increases the likelihood that a child's eyes will drift off or they get distracted, whether in person or at home. So that's a really, really powerful component, is to just be very visual driven, try to annotate. We also tell folks that it's just really, really valuable to create interactivity. And there's some really cool tools. The one we talk about a little bit and we might dig into more is sort of Edpuzzle and others like that. But basically, a tool like that allows you to embed questions in your video. So kids are watching for a minute and a half, a question pops up, they need to respond to that question, and ensures they're staying engaged. There are these nice checks for understanding, and then they pivot back to the video. And it creates this nice interactivity so the kids feel like they're a part of the learning experience, as opposed to sort of compliantly disengaged. And that's, similar with guided notes as well, right? Guided notes serve a very similar purpose, where kids are tracking what you're doing, they're logging important information down, and allows them to stay committed and engaged.
Right. And we are going to get into a little bit more in depth about the interactivity and some options people have for that a little bit later. So if people are listening and wondering what's that tool he just said, we're going to get into those details in a few more minutes. So you were talking about, annotating on the screen if possible. And we're going to also talk about tools that you can use to help with that. If a person doesn't have tools that they can do that with, for example, I make a lot of my screencasts with PowerPoint. I don't have something like Explain Anything where I can use a stylus and write directly on the screen. One of the things you recommend is using animations where the text does not all come at the same time. It's sort of layered into the slide as you're talking about that. So can you explain a little bit about that in terms of making things move on the screen while you're talking instead of it all just being plopped on there at once?
Yeah, absolutely. So, anyone who's been a teacher has seen what happens when you display a PowerPoint slide or a presentation with a whole bunch of text and you tell the kids to take notes. what usually happens is they try to write every single thing down at once. I'm pretty sure every teacher has said to kids before, don't write everything yet, all that kind of stuff, because what happens is you just lose all the focus of the students.
Yeah.
The same fundamental principle applies in instructional videos. So if I just display all my information on a slide that's going to take me 2 to 3 minutes to walk through, kids are not going to listen to what you're saying. They're just going to write everything down.
Mm-hmm.
So when you use PowerPoint animations and Google Slide animations, it's basically a slow release of information. So it ensures that a child who's watching the video is also looking at something that pertains to what you're saying, as opposed to looking at stuff that's on the slide that doesn't pertain to what you're saying in the moment. So by doing little structures like that, it relieves you as an educator from having all the advanced tools to allow you to actually annotate and write on a screen, and allows you to use the tools that almost everyone has, which would be Google Slides or PowerPoint.
Right.
So that's really powerful. I would also add that every screencaster has a pen function. Now, it's very difficult to write an equation or a sentence with a mouse, but it is not that difficult to underline and circle text or point at things with a mouse.
Mm-hmm.
So when you use animations and you animate in text, then you layer on top the power of just simple annotations like underlining and circling, and you build a pretty engaging video without having all the advanced tools.
Got it. See, I forgot about that. But with the screencasting tools, you can also build in some movement there. And also, while we're on the subject of animations, and I asked you to add this because this is a pet peeve of mine, but sometimes people go really, really overboard with the animations, and they use the word that loads by spinning in, and it takes 5 or 6 seconds for the word to actually load, or the sound effects that swoop things in over and over again. And those can just become a really unnecessary distraction.
Sure. And I would add, remember that your primary goal with instructional videos is efficiency. So anything that isn't efficient should be removed.
Yes.
You're working on a short time constraint, and the goal is to get students to be working on the actual content as fast as possible. Whether you're direct directioning in person or you're using a screencast, in the end, it's the least engaging part of a lesson experience. The best part is doing the work, right? And that's where real action's happening. So where you can cut time, you should cut time. And certainly a flying in set of words as an animation is a great opportunity to cut time.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the planning process. You've actually got an infographic that's really helpful in terms of people understanding how much time gets devoted to different tasks of creating and delivering a screencast. So talk a little bit about, how we plan to create one.
Absolutely. So, to start, it's important to understand the 4 phases that we kind of isolate at the Modern Classrooms Project. So it's planning, recording, enhancing, and sharing. And really, the bulk of your work is equal parts planning and recording. And this is a misconception a lot of folks have. They kind of have this vision of building instructional videos, and it's like all this extremely difficult and overwhelming work recording. But actually planning is what makes the recording process smooth. And it's frankly the most important part. It's what you're going to be talking about. And this is not that different from real instruction, right? Great planned lessons take time. The implementation of them don't necessarily take anywhere near as much time.
Right.
Now, when you're planning, you want to think about what the fundamental visuals you're creating for your screencast is, because that's the guiding piece of work that kids will be watching and you will be talking over. Now, we strongly encourage folks to basically plan slide decks. And on our Modern Classrooms online course and our trainings, we actually provide a slide deck template that allows educators to sort of think about how they can chunk content in a way that's both digestible, easy to follow, and clean and simple for kids to really think about the flow of information. If you don't use slide decks and you don't like PowerPoint, but you have a bunch of guided notes, which is actually relatively common. So if you're a teacher who passes out guided notes all the time, and that's where kids take notes, and then you lecture in person, lots of folks will actually use the guided notes themselves as the actual background of their screencast, as the visual. But what's really, really important is this is where the bulk of the research comes into play. This is where the length of time will fundamentally be determined. If you plan a 35 slide deck, that's going to be a really long video. But if you can keep your slides to 4 to 5 slides, ideally, if you ensure that they're visual heavy, if you create space for yourself to annotate and highlight and underline and all that kind of stuff, then the recording process is actually quite straightforward. And the more comfortable you get with the recording tool, it's really, really smooth. So when I think myself about building a screencast, I don't stress about the recording. I stress about the planning. That's where the bulk of the work is happening.
Okay. And just making sure that you really kind of got a good script, even if you need one or whatever it is, so that it sort of reminds me of painting a room. I end up being surprised at how much time it's taking to sort of like sand out rough spots and tape the corners and everything. It's like, man, this prep is taking forever. But if you do it right, then the actual painting process is pretty quick.
Yeah. And I will tell you, if you are a person that's remotely nervous about building videos, don't go in there unplanned.
Right.
Because when you do, you will be fumbling all over yourself, and then you get nervous. And it's actually kind of funny because you're getting nervous and no one's in the room and you're by yourself and you can just re-record. But I've seen teachers like literally blush and like start sweating as if they're putting on a performance.
Right.
And if you're worried about that, then plan a little bit more. And in some cases, you could write a script. Now, I caution folks to not overdo stuff like that.
Right.
I think the planning of the visuals is really important, but remember, you're focusing on being personal and not being pretty with it. So over scripting a video is both a waste of time and going to make more stress, because if you go a little off script, then you're going to freak out a little bit. Right. I remember learning this quickly because I had once built a script for one of the first videos I created, and then a fire truck comes like flying by my house and you can hear the engine roaring. And, I cursed to myself and I stopped the video and I truncated. And then I kind of thought back and I said, like, why didn't I just point out to my students that a fire truck just drove by and then keep going?
Yeah.
And that's actually interesting. And once I did that, I've done that many a times. Kids think it's really funny and it adds another layer of engagement, right? Yes. So it's stuff like that you got to be careful about planning well on the visual side, but not over planning the communication and delivery. Because that can become sort of a process that's both unnecessary and creates more complications for yourself.
Right. Okay, so let's get into the tools a little bit.
Sure.
What kind of tools do you recommend? And we've had this conversation too about how there's so much out there, that the approach that that you guys take, and I take this in my own online course too, is to just pick one or two, teach people how to use those, and then once they've got those skills, they can go and try some other stuff. So you recommend 2 basic tools for this.
Yeah, and I think what's important to remember is a couple things. One, there's a lot of ed tech products out there, and they do a lot of very similar things. So it's less about the individual brand and more about the category of tool. And the way that you should think about it is sort of there's these 2 style products. The best product is an interactive whiteboard. And an interactive whiteboard means that you actually are using a touchscreen device. That would be an iPad, a tablet, a 2-in-1 computer. And what an interactive whiteboard does is a lot like what it sounds. You just literally can write on the screen, and it's a whiteboard. It has all these cool tools and functionalities to add pictures and images and all that good stuff. And what's really, really special about these interactive whiteboards is you get to decide what the background of your whiteboard is. So if you've built a slide deck, you actually upload that slide deck. So instead of your whiteboard being a blank piece of white surface, it's actually the slides that you created. And you have this unbelievable amount of flexibility to annotate and write on top of it. It's just really, really powerful. And the good ones, so the ones that we recommend, which is Explain Everything, is a tool that actually has an embedded recorder and an embedded editor. So this tool really has it all. You basically upload a slide deck in there, you build your videos in there, you can truncate, edit, record, and then you just simply export that video out. And if you have an iPad or a tablet, you can just export it out to your Google Drive, directly onto your computer. You can get a link directly to send to kids. So it's just a really powerful tool with a lot of upside. But obviously, that tool is reliant on you having a touchscreen device, which not everyone has. And if you do have a touchscreen device, you'll want to get a stylus. And a stylus, is just basically a pen that you use on touchscreen devices. There's some really expensive ones, and then there's some really, really cheap ones. I wouldn't go with the super cheap ones because the super cheap ones don't allow you to write any fine print. So it sort of defeats the purpose. You might as well use your finger. But one that we recommend is the Miko Universal Stylus. It's $20. It comes with a pack of 2. And it's actually designed for precision writing. So they have this little kind of thing at the end of the stylish that allows you to sort of create really interesting angles, so it truly feels like a pen or a pencil that you're using. So it's a really powerful one. It works on almost every touchscreen device we've seen. It's certainly the ones that we purchased for all of our fellows, and it's just really powerful and easy to use.
Great. So if a person does not have a touchscreen and they cannot use Explain Everything, then what traditional screencast tool do you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, the easiest one, and frankly, I think the most popular one, is Screencast-O-Matic.
Yeah.
Now, the reason why we say you should use Screencast-O-Matic is a couple reasons. One, it's an actual program as opposed to a Chrome extension.
Mm-hmm.
So it has a little bit more of an infrastructure to it. You actually have like an actual app that's on your computer that opens the recorder. It can store the videos on your computer. So it's a little bit more comprehensive in that way.
Mm-hmm.
It's also just really, really easy to use. And we've built a very clear tutorial on how to use it that is both in the piece that's getting published as well as on the online course.
Mm-hmm.
And when you think about screencasts, there's a few things you really want to make sure that are available on a screencast. The first is you want to have a pen function, because if you do want to underline and circle and all that kind of stuff, you want to make sure it's there. And certainly Screencast-O-Matic has that. The second really, really important function, it's frankly the most important function, is the truncate function. And a lot of folks wonder what that is. When you think about the concept of truncating, all it is saying I can go to a random point in my video and restart recording from there. Now, that might sound like a silly tool to care that much about, but imagine you're recording a video, you've spent a lot of time planning, you're 4 minutes in, and you say something off, or you make an actual error, or you really don't like the way you wrote something. A lot of times what teachers will do is just pause, trash the recording, and re-record the whole thing.
Yeah.
What truncating allows you to do is just scroll back to that point, you hit truncate, and you basically just pick up your recording right from there. So it's kind of what that does is it just like allows you to have a pretty high functionality editing tool that's really valuable. And it's frankly the only editing tool that almost all of our educators use. You don't need to add complicated cuts and cropping stuff and combining stuff. That's all unnecessary, really hard work. If you're good at it, fantastic, rock with it. But most folks are just going to use that truncate function, and Screencast-O-Matic is super, super easy to do that with.
Great. And I found Screencast-O-Matic, even the paid version of it is pretty affordable. I think I pay like $15 a year for it or something like that.
Right.
So
Right.
it's really, it does not break the bank in any way to get some of those extra features added on.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why we pick it as well, right? Because it's so incredibly cheap for a big payoff.
Yeah.
And I would warn folks, like, it's worth the payment, because I think the free one both caps the amount of recording you can do. In other words, you can only do a certain video length. And there's some little functionality there that is really valuable, like the way that the cursor looks and some of the quality of the videos when we actually download them, that are just like really unnecessary and are quite frustrating. So it's worth the upgrade. A lot of times, I use free tools whenever I can, but this is one where it's a small enough price for enough payoff that it's worth investing in.
Okay. So what about microphones?
Honestly, believe it or not, they just don't matter all that much.
Okay.
In fact, I know some teachers who don't even have headphones and a mic when they record. They just go in a silent room.
Yeah.
I tend to believe that it's much safer to just have headphones with a mic. I have made probably 300 to 400 screencasts in my teaching career, and I've used a simple Apple set of iPhones that whole time. So,
Right.
you certainly don't need anything special. Now, for our fellows, what we'll sometimes do is we'll actually order the ones with adjustable mics. So it's sort of like, when you think about like a conferencing center when everyone's in rows and they're, picking up calls, they have that little mic that goes around in front of your mouth. There's
Right.
so many of these. I wouldn't invest in one that's particularly expensive. And in fact, some of the cheapest ones are gaming system ones. So if you have some kids out there who have Xboxes and they've been wearing these gaming mics that they use to communicate with their friends, I would encourage you to consider actually, just using your kid's mic. But basically, you can use any mic with a headphone, just like an Apple set of headphones. Or you can kind of take it to the upgraded version, which would be a mic with an adjustable set of a set of headphones with an adjustable mic that allows you to kind of move it around and speak directly into it. But I would just not spend too much money unless this is something you're super, super passionate about.
Okay. So once you have done your recording, we said earlier that we were going to get into some of the options for actually making the video more interactive for students. So let's talk about some of those now.
Absolutely. So, unlike all the other ed tech products, there's actually not that many in this particular space, which is a little bit of a relief.
Mm-hmm.
So the first way to make your video interactive is to be able to embed questions and pop-up bubbles. It's just a really cool way to create these checks for understanding. And, one thing that drove me absolutely nuts as an educator is I would get coached all the time to do checks for understanding. And then I'd do them, and I realized that they reached like 1 to 2 kids in the entire room. And I didn't understand what the purpose of that was. So I'm supposed to pose a question to the room. 2 or 3 kids are going to answer it. Almost always it's the same kids, unless you're putting someone, kind of on blast and calling them out. So what am I really doing through this process other than just getting a few kids to share their ideas? When you can embed a question into your video, it ensures that actually every child engages in the check for understanding. So not only is it just a great tool for videos, it's a great tool for teaching in general. The tool that we encourage folks to use is Edpuzzle. It's probably the most popular and most streamlined embedding question tool.
Mm-hmm.
And what I tell folks about this, because I think folks often misunderstand this, Edpuzzle is not a place where you build a video.
Right.
You upload the video you've built there, and then you add in the questions. So it's actually a tool that I only use for 5-7 minutes per video I create. I've built my video, I've done all the planning and the recording. I just throw it on there, and then I get to pick random points in the video that make sense to me to embed questions. And one tool that we tell folks about, which is super cool, is you don't actually just have to use questions. You can also do pop-up bubbles. So let's say you built a 6-minute video, and at the 4-minute mark, you talk about a concept that maybe some kids will want to delve into further. You can put a pop-up bubble in there and then actually throw a link to a website or an article. So if a kid chooses to, they can actually access that article and go read something or check something else out and then return back to the video. So very powerful tool in that way. And a couple other things to know about Edpuzzle. You have 2 options when you create an Edpuzzle account. Option 1, when you've built a video, is to use a public link, which means I'm just taking this link. I might be putting it on my Google Classroom or my Canvas or my class website. Kids watch it. The questions appear. They answer it. But you're not collecting that data.
Got it.
So it's an interactive video, but not data you're not necessarily collecting. The other option, and for folks who really use Edpuzzle in a powerful way, actually build their own classes on Edpuzzle. So you actually have students logging in, you're tracking their answers, and if you really want to, you can even grade them in certain ways using the tool as well. So that's the main one. The other option is Play Pause It. We have less experience with that one. Edpuzzle has proven to be a really powerful and effective tool, and we have a big tutorial on how to use it.
Great. One question about if you were to use the public link where you aren't actually collecting the answers from the students, do the students still get feedback on their answers when they answer those pop-up questions?
Fantastic question. So, obviously in teaching and learning, we talk about the importance of sort of higher order thinking questions and kids really engaging deeply in the work. And that's what generally is going to happen when they work on the assignments. But when you talk about an instructional video, there's a lot of value in immediate feedback.
Right.
I learn something, I do a question, I see the answer. And the real way to do that is to use multiple choice questions. So when you use a multiple choice question in Edpuzzle, which should be the bulk of your questions, especially if you're not tracking the data, as soon as a kid selects the answer, they're going to be told whether it's the right answer or the wrong answer, and they will be told what the right answer is. And that's a cool tool, both because it gives immediate feedback to students, and when you're in the in-person setting, a lot of kids will actually ask you why they got the question wrong. So it creates this nice data-driven way that drives questions from kids and allows them to engage, again, in what oftentimes can be sort of a compliant learning experience, like a direct lecture. So it forces them to think comprehensively about the content, answer a question, and then get that feedback, and it might prompt another question, which is an interesting process.
Okay, so a platform like Edpuzzle or Play Pause It, if people want to check that out too, sort of it's a platform for watching videos and actually building more of a lesson around it that has some embedded questions and stopping points so that it gets more interactive.
Right.
And then the other recommendation that you make, and I've seen this research too, is really strong on the power of guided notes for keeping students engaged in a lecture. So talk a little bit about how a teacher could do that with a screencast.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, first of all, it makes perfect sense, right? If you give a kid a video that's 6 minutes long and don't give them anything to do with it, it's a good chance they're just going to stare off into space, right? Yeah. I would personally,
right?
Especially if it was not something I was particularly passionate about. So creating guided notes creates accountability for the student, for the teacher, and ensures that there's a way for them to engage in the content. Now, the issue with guided notes that I've seen many times before is I think sometimes educators feel like they shouldn't give their kids too much information. Like the kids need to be both writing down content, but also figuring out how to take notes.
Yeah.
And that's hard. It's a hard skill. And I actually would argue that skill is sort of disappearing because content is digital anyways. Professors pass out slides in college.
Yeah.
So what's more important is you're encouraging engagement, not that you're forcing kids to kind of create a new method to taking down notes and organizing information. So in my opinion, easiest way, print the slides. What we do in our fellowship is we tell teachers to just screenshot each slide, throw it on a document, print it out. So kids are actually seeing the slides that you're going through, and then you can blank out information you want them to write out. If you're using guided notes already, great, you can use that. If not, there's a ton of cool resources, one that we link in the actual piece itself, that just walks through like sort of note-taking structures, the ones like Cornell Notes, to create this sort of clean, structured way for kids to actually take notes. I would discourage folks, unless you're teaching much older kids that are very skilled at this, from just saying take notes.
Right.
That's just not particularly effective. It also leads to a really just broad diversity of sort of information that people have retained from the video.
Yes.
This provides them more structure.
Right. It may actually be more effective to have a note-taking lesson as opposed to asking them to multitask during these videos, where the point is to just get the information to them instead of,
right.
Yeah.
And when I talk about accountability, by the way, this is really, really valuable. You know, when a student comes and asks you a question about a lesson that was based off of a screencast, if you didn't give them a note-taking structure and they took notes sort of, you know, the best they could, and then you ask them to refer to their notes and they don't have it, it's very easy for the child to say, well, I didn't catch that, or I don't know what you're talking about, or I didn't know I was supposed to write that down. But when you give them guided notes, there's a clear points in those videos where they're writing things down and you've created a structure. So if they haven't done it, you can say, look, you got to go back to that video and go to that specific part again. And so it creates a nice accountability structure for you and the student that is really makes your life easier.
Boy, you know, that actually makes me think, if people have the wherewithal to do this while they're creating guided notes, how nice would it be if you could actually put a timestamp every once in a while on those notes? For where certain pieces of information occur, even if it's just every minute, just right here, this is where the 2-minute mark is, this is where the 4-minute mark is, so that they can more easily go back and find that information if they need to review it.
I know a number of teachers who actually do exactly that. So they've sectioned their notes off at slide by slide, and they'll say that, you know, the 2 to 3 minute mark is this slide. So it creates a really quick way to go back to content.
Really nice. Okay, so I think we have pretty much talked about all of the components of creating good screencasts, and I hope this is going to help people. I want to just circle back now to the Modern Classrooms project. That is your baby now. And you guys have a free course that we're going to link teachers to that can show them how to, it's going to review a lot of the stuff that we talked about, but also larger scale things about building whole units, you know, that are built around video. And then you actually have a paid offering that offers a lot more mentoring. So talk about what you all are doing over there and what you have to offer to teachers.
Absolutely. So, you know, what's fascinating about our work, particularly now, is when we built this model, this is an in-person model that's supposed to be implemented. And in fact, it's not supposed to be particularly high tech. In other words, you build instructional videos to replace lectures, but a lot of the work is happening in person. It's physical, and it's not just kids staring on screen. So it is an in-person model. I think a lot of folks are engaging in it now because they're trying to problem solve distance learning. So if you want to just learn our information, we're a nonprofit. We don't hide content from folks. So you can just go to our free course, learn.modernclassrooms.org. It's right there in the piece, and you'll have access to all of our tutorials. And you'll be able to kind of learn from that experience and be able to see some exemplars and so on and so forth. But really what we found, this is both through our fellowship program, training entire schools and districts, is that teachers need support through this process. This is not an easy task to sort of redesign your classroom and start by just eliminating a lecture, which, you know, for years might be the way that you've taught. And one of the best ways to do that is to provide differentiated supports where, you know, every teacher has different needs and we address those needs teacher by teacher. So what we've created is the Modern Classrooms Mentorship Program. And this is conducted through an online course. So basically, any educator that chooses to be a part of the Modern Classrooms Mentorship Program would register for it. It costs $299, and you get paired with one of our experts. And we give you feedback on all the assignments you do throughout the course so that you actually submit a full completed unit plan at the end that's ready for students to actually access. You have on-demand personalized coaching. So throughout the upgraded mentorship program, you can click on a link and you go to a Google form and you literally just tell us exactly what you need coaching on, and we schedule a one-to-one Zoom call with you and we go over it. So that might mean that you are really struggling to get Screencast-O-Matic off the ground. So we'll walk you through how to do that over a video conferencing experience. You might want to wrestle with sort of some philosophical ideas around sort of blended instruction, screencasting, and self-paced learning. And we talk about that. We might look at your learning management system, so your Google Classroom or your Canvas or your Blackboard or your Schoology, and really talk through the best ways to embed screencasts in them and use them for self-paced learning. So it's a comprehensive experience, and our fundamental goal is to ensure that you, the educator, are leaving that experience able to implement our entire model in full, blended self-paced, mastery-based learning in the actual in-person setting or in the distance learning setting. And we're also approved by George Mason University. So if you do complete that course, the mentorship program, you do get 3 continuing education credits approved by George Mason. And we're also offering through Cult of Pedagogy, a promo code. So basically, if you type in Cult of Pedagogy in the promo code, you'll get $50 off to join the mentorship program.
Fantastic. That sounds like such a good program. And I just wanted to sort of underscore again what you've said several times here, which is that you originally intended this model to be something for the in-person classroom where it's a blended learning model. Students are working at their own pace, using the videos, but you're there as their teacher. We now are talking in April of 2020, where it happens to be that a lot of people have been forced into a distance learning situation. So I have a feeling that once this pandemic crisis is past, that there are going to be a lot more teachers who are more comfortable using technology to deliver some of their instruction. And so I have a feeling that even when we are back in the regular classroom, that there will be more people trying blended learning models anyway. So this can be a flexible model that can move back and forth really between in-person and distance learning situations.
Absolutely. And I encourage folks to just go on our website, modernclassrooms.org. Make sure you put the S on classrooms. And on there's a couple really powerful places to go to understand what this model looks like. First, it's our Edutopia video. It's about 5 minutes long. You'll see it right there. It's got plenty of views, and that's our actual classroom in action. So multiple classrooms, my classroom when I was implementing the model, as well as a history classroom, implementing the in-person experience. You really get to see what the vision is over time as opposed to just focusing on the current moment. In addition to that, I would encourage folks to go to our media page because our fellows write a ton about their experience implementing the model. And that's a really good place to hear from English teachers and science teachers and math teachers who have all made this model their own and implemented it themselves.
And they have worked with very diverse populations. I wanted to sort of make sure we point that out too. This is not just in upper middle class schools that are loaded with, the best cutting edge technology.
No. In fact, it's largely the opposite. So our fellowship out here, where we will have over 70 teachers implementing the model starting in September. These are all teachers who support highly diverse populations, generally schools that have a high percentage of free and reduced lunch.
Right.
We also support schools and districts and teachers in environments where that's not the case. So it's quite flexible, works with any curriculum or content area. So we are ready to support in any way, shape, or form.
Kareem, you are doing really good work. I'm honored that you agreed to come on here and that you're sharing this information. And I hope this sends a lot of people over to Modern Classrooms Project.
Thank you for having me. It was a joy.
Thanks a lot. For links to all the resources mentioned in this episode, including Kareem's full post and the free course on the Modern Classrooms Project, visit cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 144. To get a weekly email from me about my newest blog posts, podcast episodes, and products, sign up for my mailing list at cultofpedagogy.com/subscribe. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great day.